What does it truly take to be complicit in some of the greatest crimes in human history while never once firing a weapon, signing a death warrant with your own hand, or personally ordering a single deportation? What if the answer is simply this: to live well, to wear the jewels, to sit at the dinner table and ask no questions about who polished the silver, who cut the flowers, who cooked the meals, and who had owned the plates before they arrived in your dining room? To host the parties, to smile for the cameras, to look away deliberately and consistently and with perfect elegance, while the world around you burns and the people whose possessions now fill your rooms are loaded onto sealed freight trains that carry them to places from which they will never return. Emmy Göring, born Emmy Johanna Sonnemann on March 24, 1893, in the great port city of Hamburg, Germany, was by all public accounts a celebrated actress, a devoted wife, and a loving mother. She moved through the world of the Third Reich with elegance and grace, draped in magnificent fur coats surrounded by priceless stolen art, dining at tables set with silver confiscated from Jewish families whose names she never knew and never troubled herself to learn, residing in a palace built and furnished and continuously replenished with the proceeds of systematic theft, forced labor, and industrialized mass murder. She called herself the First Lady of the Third Reich, and she was not wrong. In this video, we will find out exactly what that title cost the world around her, who paid the price for Emmy Göring's magnificent life, and what the full historical record truly reveals about a woman who chose, at every crossroads and every moment of decision, comfort over conscience, pleasure over principle, and performance over truth. So, without further ado, let us start at the very beginning. Emmy Sonnemann came into the world in the port city of Hamburg, a place of commerce, culture, and cosmopolitan ambition. That was, in the 1890s, one of the great cities of Imperial Germany. The Hamburg of Emmy's childhood was a thriving trading hub, whose docks handled goods from every corner of the globe, and whose cultural life reflected the wealth and confidence of a city that regarded itself as a place of genuine consequence in the world. Emmy's father was a businessman, and the family occupied that solidly respectable position in the middle-class social order that valued education, propriety, and the cultivation of artistic sensibility as marks of cultural achievement and social worth. From an early age, Emmy demonstrated an aptitude for performance that set her apart from her siblings and from most of her peers. She possessed the quality that certain people carry with them from birth, a quality of drawing attention without demanding it, of filling a room simply by entering it, of making other people aware of her presence in a way that was compelling rather than intrusive. This natural stage, presence which in another era and another set of circumstances might have remained a private charm exercised in domestic and social settings, found its professional outlet in the traditions of the German theatrical world, which in the early 20th century was still one of the most prestigious and demanding cultural institutions in Europe. The German theatre of Emmy's era was not entertainment in the modern commercial sense. It was a serious cultural institution, heavily subsidized by the states and municipalities of Imperial and then Weimar Germany, performing to audiences that expected intellectual and emotional engagement from what they saw on stage, and that regarded a good evening at the theatre as a genuinely significant cultural experience. The repertoire drew on the classical tradition of Goethe and Schiller, on the naturalist revolution that had brought new social realism to the European stage in the late 19th century, and on the various experimental and expressionist currents that were making the German theatre of the 1920s one of the most creatively vital in the world. To succeed in this environment required genuine skill, sustained training, and the ability to inhabit characters with sufficient conviction to satisfy audiences of considerable cultural sophistication. Emmy trained for this world and entered it with determination. She took the roles available to a young actress of her type, working her way through the theatrical system of productions and companies that constituted professional theatrical life in Germany, building her reputation gradually through the accumulation of performances. Her first marriage, entered into in the way that many young theatrical people form early relationships with colleagues who share their unusual hours and their emotional demands, was to a fellow actor named Karl Köstlin. The marriage produced no children and eventually ended in divorce. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, Emmy had established herself as a well-regarded figure in the German theatrical world, performing at the Deutsches Nationaltheater in Weimar, a theatre whose name alone carried the weight of Germany's classical cultural tradition. Weimar was the city of Goethe and Schiller, the birthplace of German classical literature and philosophy. A small city of exceptional cultural heritage in the heart of Germany, and Emmy's professional home there placed her in a world of considerable intellectual and artistic prestige. The political world of Weimar in the early 1930s was, like the political world of all of Germany, in a state of accelerating crisis. The Weimar Republic, created in the defeat of 1918 and struggling throughout its brief existence with economic catastrophe, political extremism from both left and right, and a deep cultural division over the direction of German society, was approaching the moment of its destruction. The street battles between communist and Nazi paramilitaries, the economic desperation of the Great Depression years, the parliamentary deadlock that made effective governance increasingly impossible, all of these created the conditions in which Hitler's movement was able to grow from a marginal radicalism into a mass political force capable of seizing power. Emmy lived and worked in this environment, and she was not unaware of it. The theatre in which she worked was itself a contested space, with the cultural battles between modernist experimentation and nationalist traditionalism playing out in debates about repertoire and direction and the proper relationship between art and political life. Emmy observed all of this, and then she met Hermann Göring. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born on January 12, 1893 in Rosenheim in Bavaria, making him almost exactly the same age as Emmy. His background was one of unusual social mobility and early displacement that helps explain the particular quality of his ambitions and his personality. His father, Heinrich. Ernst Göring was a German colonial official who had served as the first governor of German Southwest Africa, the territory that is today Namibia, a position of considerable importance in the expanding German colonial project of the late 19th century. The young Hermann had spent some of his earliest years in the Caribbean, where his father held a subsequent diplomatic position in Haiti before being sent back to Germany for his education, an early experience of separation from his family that left marks on his psychology that are visible throughout his subsequent career. He was educated at military cadet schools and showed from an early age the qualities that would define his military career: physical courage, competitive drive, and an instinct for dramatic self-presentation that made him stand out from his peers. His entry into military aviation during the First World War was a natural progression for a young officer of his temperament. The aerial warfare of the Great War required the exact combination of qualities that Göring possessed: individual physical courage, technical skill, competitive aggression, and the ability to perform under extreme psychological pressure. He accumulated aerial victories at a rate that brought him to the attention of the press and the public, and his command of the Richthofen Squadron after the Red Baron's death in April 1918 placed him in one of the most glamorous and publicly prominent positions in the entire German military. He ended the war with 22 aerial victories, the Pour le Mérite, and a reputation that would sustain him through the difficult post-war years. The post-war years were, as for many veterans of the defeated German military, a period of profound disorientation and resentment. The skills and the heroic identity that the war had given Göring had no civilian application in the Weimar Republic, which he and most of his fellow veterans despised as an illegitimate creation of defeat, weakness, and national humiliation. He worked briefly as a commercial pilot in Denmark and Sweden, which brought him into the social world of Scandinavian aristocracy, and eventually to the meeting with Karin von Kantzow that became the great romance of his life. Karin was a Swedish noblewoman of genuine warmth and grace, 7 years older than Göring, then still married to her first husband, who fell as completely in love with Göring as he with her. Their relationship eventually led to Karin's divorce and their marriage in 1923, a union that was genuine and tender in ways that sat oddly with everything else about Göring's career. He loved Karin with a consistency and a depth that distinguished their relationship from almost everything else in his life, and her death from tuberculosis in October 1931, after years of illness that he had watched helplessly, left him with a grief that was genuine and that shaped in complex ways his subsequent emotional life. Back in Germany in the early 1920s, Göring had encountered the political movement that would define the rest of his life. He attended a Hitler speech in 1921 and was, by his own account and that of contemporaries, immediately and overwhelmingly captured by the personal magnetism of the man and the national pride of the message. Hitler, for his part, recognized immediately what Göring offered: military prestige, social connections that reached into the nationalist establishment, physical courage, and organizational energy. He put Göring in command of the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the paramilitary wing of the movement, in 1922, a role in which Göring's personality and his martial authority found immediate practical expression. The beer hall putsch of November 1923 wounded him physically and drove him into exile, but the period of exile was not wasted. He spent time in Sweden, in Italy, in Austria, rebuilding his health, losing it again to morphine, recovering and eventually returning to Germany under the general amnesty of 1927 to resume his place in the Nazi movement's expanding political organization. His election to the Reichstag in 1928 as one of the 12 Nazi deputies marked his formal return to German political life, and the movement's subsequent growth in the elections of 1930 and 1932, in which the Nazis became first the second largest and then the largest party in the Reichstag, accelerated his rise dramatically. By the time Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Göring was already one of the most powerful men in the movement, positioned to take control of the Prussian state apparatus as Minister of the Interior and to begin building the organizational infrastructure of the Nazi state in its most critical early months. It was in this context, at this moment of rapidly accumulating power and ambition and authority, that his relationship with Emmy Sonnemann deepened into the commitment that would take them both to Berlin Cathedral and to everything that followed. The wedding of Hermann Göring and Emmy Sonnemann on April 10, 1935, was one of the defining public spectacles of the Nazi era, a piece of theatrical self-promotion that reflected with almost perfect clarity the personality of the groom, the aspirations of the regime, and the role that Emmy was stepping into with full awareness of its implications. The Berlin Cathedral, the Berliner Dom on Museum Island, was chosen with Göring's characteristic eye for historical resonance and architectural grandeur. This was not merely a church, but the dynastic church of the Hohenzollern emperors, the burial place of Prussian royalty going back centuries, a building whose associations spoke of power, legitimacy, and the depth of a cultural tradition that the Nazi regime was simultaneously claiming as its inheritance and destroying by its actions. The cathedral's size and grandeur provided a stage equal to the occasion's intended significance. Adolf Hitler's role as witness to the ceremony was not a casual social appearance by a political colleague attending a friend's wedding. It was a calculated political act, a public statement that this marriage had the personal blessing and active participation of the Führer himself, that the new Frau Göring was elevated by Hitler's presence into the innermost circle of the Nazi state's social hierarchy. The guest list assembled in the cathedral nave read as a catalogue of the men who would, within a decade, stand in the dock at Nuremberg or die by their own hands in the ruins of their shattered empire. Heinrich Himmler was there, the Reichsführer SS, the former chicken farmer who had built the SS into the most powerful and most feared organization in the Third Reich, and who would oversee the construction of the extermination camps that killed 6 million Jews. Joseph Goebbels was there, the Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, whose genius for manipulation and whose contemptible hypocrisy made him one of the more repellent figures in the Nazi gallery. Rudolf Hess was there, the devoted deputy Führer who would later fly solo to Scotland in a bizarre peace mission. Ribbentrop, Himmler, Speer, the generals, the diplomats, the industrialists, the entire machinery of the regime was assembled to witness Emmy's transformation into the First Lady of the Third Reich. Over Berlin on that April day in 1935, Luftwaffe aircraft flew in formation above the cathedral, a display of military power that functioned simultaneously as a wedding present from the groom to the city and as a demonstration to Germany and the world of the might of the force that Göring had built in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. The gifts that poured in from across the hierarchy of the Nazi state and from foreign governments eager to demonstrate their goodwill toward the Reich's second most powerful figure included jewels, artworks, silver, furniture, and luxury objects of every description. Emmy received these gifts as the natural due of her new position, without recorded hesitation or discomfort about the implications of accepting them from the figures who presented them. She was now Frau Göring, and Frau Göring received what was offered. The honeymoon in Rome, where the couple was received by Benito Mussolini with full official honours, confirmed Emmy's new status in the diplomatic world. She was not merely a German citizen visiting Italy, she was the wife of the Reich's most publicly prominent figure after Hitler himself, and she was received accordingly, with the ceremonies and the social attentions that the Italian fascist state extended to important visitors from its ideological ally. Emmy accepted all of this with the ease of a woman who had spent her career learning to project authority and confidence from a stage, and she returned to Germany ready to assume the social role that her marriage had conferred. The role of hostess to which Emmy immediately applied herself was one that the Nazi regime needed, and that Emmy was uniquely qualified to fill. Hitler's public celibacy, his determined maintenance of the fiction that he was married only to Germany, left a gap in the social architecture of the regime that no one else in the Nazi leadership could fill as effectively as Emmy Göring. The wives of other senior Nazis did not have Emmy's combination of theatrical training, social confidence, cultural education, and personal attractiveness that made her an effective representative of the regime in high-level social settings. She became the organizer and presiding figure of the state dinners and diplomatic receptions at which the regime presented itself to the world. The woman who stood at Hitler's side when foreign heads of state were received, who managed the seating plans and the menus, and the conversational dynamics of evenings that were simultaneously social occasions and instruments of foreign policy. The rivalry with Eva Braun, already mentioned, deserves additional context to fully understand its significance. Eva Braun was, in the social world of the Nazi elite, a person of no official standing whatsoever. She was Hitler's private companion, permitted by him to attend a limited number of official functions strictly in private capacity, not introduced to foreign dignitaries, not photographed in official contexts, and not acknowledged in the press. This was a deeply frustrating position for a woman who understood perfectly what she was to Hitler, but who was denied any public recognition of it. Emmy's assumption of the First Lady role, her open declaration of herself as such, her exclusion of Eva from the social world that Emmy dominated, was experienced by Eva as a personal humiliation and as a challenge to whatever sense of status she could derive from her relationship with Hitler. Eva complained. Hitler listened. The result was Emmy's exclusion from the Berghof, which Emmy chose to regard as a minor inconvenience, rather than the significant rebuke it actually was, and her determination to maintain her social position from the other great stages that were available to her, of which Carinhall was by far the grandest. Carinhall in its full development was a structure and an estate that challenged ordinary descriptive categories. It had begun, in the early 1930s, as a relatively modest country house that Göring built in the Schorfheide forest northeast of Berlin, and named after his first wife, Karin. By the time Emmy moved in following their 1935 wedding, the original modest structure had already been substantially enlarged and transformed. And the transformation continued year after year as Göring's resources and ambitions grew together, until by the late 1930s and the early war years, Carinhall had become something that no adequate English word easily captures. Part palace, part museum, part hunting lodge, part theme park, part fantasy of personal omnipotence, all of it funded by the proceeds of crimes that the world had not yet fully comprehended. The main building was constructed in the architectural vocabulary of the Nordic Longhouse, drawing on German Romantic nationalism's idealization of the ancient Germanic past, its dark, heavy timbers and vaulted ceilings and carved wooden details evoking, deliberately and with Göring's full approval, associations with the heroic age of the Norse peoples that Nazi mythology had appropriated as the genetic and cultural ancestors of the German nation. Wings extended from the central hall in multiple directions, each housing different functions and different portions of the growing collection. There was a great main hall of imposing proportions where the most significant social events were held, hung with tapestries and dominated by the works of art that Göring had selected as the statement pieces of his collection. There were private apartments for the family, decorated with paintings chosen for their aesthetic harmony with the rooms they occupied. There were guest suites for the distinguished visitors who came regularly to experience the famous Göring hospitality. There were libraries, there were smoking rooms, there were dressing rooms of a scale appropriate to a man who owned dozens of different uniforms and who changed his costume with the theatrical regularity of someone who understood instinctively that presentation was power. The model railway deserves its own mention because it captures something essential about the psychology of the man who built Carinhall and who was Emmy's husband. Göring had constructed, in a purpose-built room of substantial size, a model railway layout of extraordinary complexity and scale, with multiple lines running through miniature landscapes complete with mountains and valleys and tunnels and stations, with realistic signal systems and switching mechanisms, with locomotives and rolling stock of various types and periods. He played with this railway himself, personally operating the controls with evident pleasure, receiving guests in the railway room and demonstrating the system with proprietorial pride. It was psychologically a fascinating displacement. The man who commanded the Luftwaffe and who had at his disposal the real machinery of transportation and destruction had also created a private toy world over which his personal control was complete and benign, where nothing could go wrong unless he chose to derail a train himself. Emmy shared her husband's home with this installation, received his guests in the railway room, and apparently regarded it as simply another of Herman's enthusiasms, no more or less remarkable than the hunting or the art. The hunting operations at Carinhall were managed with the seriousness appropriate to Göring's position as Reichsjägermeister, the Reich Hunting Master, a title he had given himself in 1934, along with the authority to set all hunting regulations in Germany. The Shorefinder was transformed under his management from ordinary forest into a managed wildlife estate of extraordinary quality, stocked with game that was maintained and monitored by professional foresters and gamekeepers whose employment was a dedicated function of the estate's operation. The reintroduction of European bison, which had been extinct in the wild since the early 20th century, was one of Göring's genuinely significant contributions to wildlife conservation, whatever one makes of the context in which it was made. Göring hunted seriously and enthusiastically, rising early on hunting mornings and spending long hours in the field with the weapons and the dogs and the professional guides that the estate provided. Emmy accompanied him on some of these occasions, though hunting was more Herman's passion than hers. She was more consistently present at the social events that the hunting culture of Carinhall generated, the elaborate dinners that followed successful hunts, the gatherings of hunting guests from the German military and political elite, and from the aristocratic circles of other European countries, the rituals of the hunting table that Göring performed with the thoroughness of a man who had decided that everything in his world should be done at the highest possible level of elaboration. The household staff of Carinhall numbered in the hundreds when all categories of employment were counted. The domestic servants who maintained the house itself, the kitchen staff who produced the famous dinners, the ground staff who managed the gardens and the forest, the gamekeepers who managed the hunting, the Luftwaffe Guard detachment that provided security, the administrative staff who managed the estate's complex logistics, the specialist staff who cared for the art collection, and others. Emmy managed the domestic portion of this establishment with the authority of the mistress of the house, giving instructions through a hierarchy of head servants and housekeepers, setting the standards for the household's presentation, and bearing primary responsibility for the social calendar that was the most visible product of the whole apparatus. She was not merely an inhabitant of Carinhall, she was its presiding social intelligence, the person who determined what it was for and how it would present itself to the world. The other Göring properties deserve mention alongside Carinhall, because they illustrate the scale of Emmy's material world and the extent to which every element of it was funded by power, exercised without legal constraint. Göring maintained an official residence in Berlin at the Palais Göring on Wilhelmstrasse, which served as his official government offices as well as his city residence. He had a property at Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps in the same area as Hitler's Berghof, which served as a mountain retreat. He had a hunting estate called Rominten in East Prussia, near the border with Lithuania, which was famous among European hunters as one of the finest deer forests on the continent, and which Göring managed with the same obsessive attention he applied to Carinhall. He had use of the medieval Weldenstein Castle in Franconia, which had sentimental associations with his family's history, and which he restored and maintained as another element of his network of residences. In Poland, the Nazi occupation had placed additional properties at his disposal. All of these establishments required staff, maintenance, and the continuous expenditure of resources that the combination of Göring's official salaries, his various financial arrangements with German industry, and the proceeds of the looting operation provided. The art looting operation that produced the Göring collection and that Emmy lived within is one of the most extensively documented episodes of cultural theft in history. And the documentation allows us to understand it with a precision that illuminates Emmy's complicity in specific and concrete terms rather than merely general ones. The operation developed in stages that paralleled the expansion of German military power across Europe, beginning within Germany itself and extending outward as each new conquest opened new territories and new collections to appropriation. Within Germany, the dispossession of Jewish art collectors and dealers began in 1933. with a combination of legal persecution and economic pressure that forced many Jewish families to sell their holdings at a fraction of their genuine value, or to abandon them entirely as they fled the country. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service, passed in April 1933, drove Jewish professionals from their positions and disrupted the economic base of many collecting families. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 further restricted the economic activities of Jewish citizens and accelerated the pressure to liquidate assets. Jewish art dealers in particular found themselves in an impossible position. Their businesses depended on their ability to operate in the German market, and that ability was being systematically destroyed. Göring and his agents were active buyers in this market, and they understood perfectly that the prices agreed upon were accepted under duress rather than in any genuine sense of fair exchange. The Austrian annexation of March 1938, the Anschluss that incorporated Austria into the German Reich without a shot being fired, opened a new territory of extraordinary richness to the looting apparatus. Vienna in 1938 was home to one of the most significant concentrations of Jewish-owned cultural property in Europe, accumulated over generations by the prosperous Jewish community that had played a central role in Austrian cultural life for more than a century. The Rothschild family's Austrian holdings alone represented one of the most significant private art collections on the continent, assembled over 4 generations by one of Europe's wealthiest and most culturally engaged families. Within weeks of the Anschluss, the apparatus of asset confiscation was at work in Vienna, stripping Jewish families of their businesses, their apartments, their bank accounts, and their art collections with a speed and thoroughness that shocked even some observers sympathetic to the regime. Emmy received her Christmas present Nazi Party membership in 1938, the same year that Vienna's Jewish community was being comprehensively robbed. The timing is worth noting. The conquest of France and the Low Countries in the spring and summer of 1940 opened the greatest concentration of privately held art in Europe to the Nazi looting apparatus. The ERR's operation in France, directed by Göring with Hitler's authorization, was an act of systematic cultural theft of a scale and thoroughness that had no modern precedent. The operation targeted Jewish-owned collections as its primary focus, but it also extended to other categories of property that the Nazis chose to define as available for German appropriation. The Rothschild family's multiple Paris properties and their country houses were stripped of their contents. The collections of the major Jewish art dealers, the Wildenstein family, who ran one of the most prestigious galleries in Paris and who had over decades assembled an inventory of old master paintings of the highest quality. The Seligman brothers, whose gallery on the Place Vendôme was one of the finest dealers in Rococo furniture and decorative arts in the world. Paul Rosenberg, whose gallery on the Rue de la Boétie represented some of the most important modern artists, including Picasso, Braque, Léger, and Matisse. All of these were targeted, their holdings inventoried and removed by ERR teams working under SS supervision. Rose Valland, the art historian working at the Jeu de Paume Museum, who secretly documented the looting operation, was able to record that between October 1940 and July 1944, approximately 21,903 art objects were shipped from Paris to Germany in 29 railway wagons. Of these, a substantial portion went to Göring's collection at Carinhall. The works Göring selected on his personal visits to the Jeu de Paume were chosen with the discriminating eye of a man who had, over years, and with the assistance of expert advisors, developed genuine knowledge of European art, however corrupt the means by which his collection was assembled. He favoured German old masters, Flemish and Dutch 17th century painting, Italian Renaissance works and French 18th century decorative arts, and the works he selected for Carinhall represented the highest quality available in each of these categories from the stolen inventory. The specific works that Emmy lived with and moved through daily included paintings that had been in the Rothschild family's possession for generations, old master drawings from the collections of Paris dealers, and decorative objects of the kind that French royal collections and the great aristocratic households of the Ancien Régime had assembled over centuries, and that Jewish collecting families had purchased after the Revolution as the treasures of the old regime entered the art market. The ERR inventories and the post-war documentation produced by Allied art investigators allow us to trace specific works with considerable precision. The painting known as The Astronomer, attributed at the time to Vermeer and since identified as a work of that rarest of old masters, was among the works that passed through the Jeu de Paume during the occupation period. Works by Fragonard, by Boucher, by Watteau, the great French painters of the Rococo period, whose graceful, pleasure-filled imagery seemed almost deliberately ironic in the context of the industrial murder being organised by the men who collected them, were present in the Göring collection. Flemish and Dutch masters whose work had been assembled over generations by Jewish collectors in Amsterdam, Brussels and Paris were hung at Carinhall. The bronze sculptures, the Gobelin tapestries woven in. The royal workshops of pre-revolutionary France, the pieces of furniture from the great French cabinet makers of the 18th century, the decorative objects in gold and silver and enamel and carved ivory, all documented, all traceable to their pre-war owners, all present in the rooms through which Emmy moved daily. There is a particular detail in the documentation of the ERR's French operations that illuminates the human reality of what Emmy benefited from. In the inventories of works seized from specific Jewish families, the objects are sometimes described with notations that indicate they came from apartments or houses whose owners had been arrested by the Gestapo or the French police, or had fled leaving their possessions behind, or had been deported east. The phrase "deported east" was the bureaucratic euphemism for what was actually happening. The transportation of Jewish families to the extermination camps of Poland, to Auschwitz-Birkenau, to Treblinka, to Sobibor, to Belzec, where they were murdered on arrival or after brief periods of forced labour. The objects taken from these families' apartments were catalogued and sent to the Jeu de Paume, and then allocated to the various recipients in the German looting apparatus. Some of them ended up at Carinhall. Emmy was living among them. The total value of the Göring collection, difficult to establish precisely given the conditions of wartime valuation and the complex post-war history of the individual works, was estimated by American art investigators immediately after the war at approximately $200 million in 1945 values, a figure that translates to many billions in contemporary terms. This was not an inheritance or a purchase or a gift in any ordinary sense. It was the material equivalent of decades of criminal accumulation, funded by the dispossession of a persecuted minority and the looting of conquered nations. Emmy inhabited this collection, enjoyed it aesthetically, and contributed to its presentation without recorded discomfort for a decade. The events of November 1938 require specific attention in any honest account of Emmy Göring's life, because they represent one of the moments at which the nature of the regime she was embedded in became absolutely unmistakable to anyone willing to look. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, on November 9th and into the early hours of November 10th, 1938, was not a spontaneous outburst of popular anger, but a carefully organised act of state terror directed against the Jewish population of Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland, the Czech territory that had been annexed just weeks earlier. The trigger was the assassination in Paris of Ernst vom Rath, a German diplomat, by Herschel Grinspan, a young Jewish man acting in desperate protest against the deportation of his parents from Germany to the Polish border. Goebbels, presenting the assassination to Hitler at the Munich gathering where the Nazi leadership was celebrating the anniversary of the beer hall putsch, suggested that it provided the occasion for a retributive action against the Jews of Germany that the regime had been planning in various forms for some time. The action that followed was directed from the top and executed from below. SA and SS men, dressed in civilian clothes to maintain the fiction of a spontaneous popular response, moved through German cities and towns in coordinated waves of destruction. Jewish-owned shops and businesses were ransacked and destroyed, their windows smashed, their contents looted or damaged beyond repair. Approximately 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were attacked in Germany and Austria. More than 1,000 synagogues were set on fire, their interiors desecrated, their Torah scrolls burned in the streets. Jewish cemeteries were vandalized and desecrated. Jews were beaten in their homes and in the streets, with at least 91 killed directly, though the true toll was certainly higher. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested in the days following the pogrom and sent to the concentration camps at Dachau, Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, where they were subjected to brutal treatment until their families could arrange their emigration from Germany by signing over their remaining assets to the state. The name Kristallnacht, Crystal Night or Night of Broken Glass, came from the extraordinary quantity of broken glass that littered the streets of German cities the following morning, the remains of the shattered shop windows, the fragments of Jewish homes and community buildings reduced to rubble and splinters. The visual evidence was everywhere and inescapable. Anyone in a German city on the morning of November 10th, 1938, could see with their own eyes what had happened. Emmy was in Berlin on that date. She saw the streets. The meeting that Emmy Göring chaired the following day, November 12, 1938, at the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, is one of the most revealing documents in the entire historical record of the Nazi era, and Emmy Göring was married to the man who ran that meeting. The transcript, which survived and was produced at Nuremberg as a prosecution exhibit, records a conversation among the senior figures of the regime about the economic and administrative consequences of the pogrom. The tone of the meeting is one of practical bureaucratic problem-solving, of men discussing an administrative challenge with the detached efficiency of officials who regard the suffering of human beings as a logistics problem rather than as a moral catastrophe. Göring's central concern was economic efficiency. The destruction of Jewish property was, he explained, counterproductive from the German perspective because the damage was partly covered by German insurance companies, which meant that the financial benefit of the destruction was not maximized for the German state. Moreover, the destruction of productive economic capacity, even Jewish-owned capacity, reduced the total output of the German economy. The solution Göring proposed and implemented was so breathtaking in its cynicism that it has retained the power to shock across the 80 years since it was imposed. He levied a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community of Germany as punishment for the damage caused during Kristallnacht. 1 billion Reichsmarks imposed on the victims of a state-organized pogrom as a financial penalty for the destruction inflicted upon them by the agents of that state. The fine was accompanied by regulations requiring that any insurance payable to Jewish property owners for Kristallnacht damage be paid not to the owners themselves, but to the German state. The net effect was that the Jewish community of Germany was required to compensate Germany for the cost of persecuting them. Göring presented this arrangement at the meeting with evident satisfaction. Emmy was his wife. She sat at his table that evening and in the days that followed. She received the servants who managed the household that his position funded. She wore the jewellery that his power provided. She did not, as far as the historical record shows, ask him a single question about what had happened on those November streets or what the meeting the next day had decided. The year 1941 was the year in which the crimes of the Nazi regime reached their ultimate expression, the point at which the policy of persecution and dispossession of the Jewish population of Europe transformed into the policy of systematic industrialized murder. The Wannsee Conference of January 20th, 1942, at which the administrative implementation of the final solution was coordinated among the various government agencies involved, is the date most associated in public understanding with the formal authorization of the Holocaust. But the authorization had come earlier, in the document that Emmy Göring signed on July 31, 1941, addressed to Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the security police and the SD, the man who would chair the Wannsee Conference 6 months later. The document is worth examining in its precise language, because its language is the language of bureaucracy applied to mass murder, and because it bears the signature of Emmy Göring's husband. Göring wrote to Heydrich, authorizing him to carry out all necessary organizational, practical and material measures for achieving a complete solution of the Jewish question in Europe. The phrase complete solution is the German Gesamtlösung, and in the context of Nazi racial policy as it had developed to that point, in the context of the ongoing mass shootings of Jews in the Soviet Union that the Einsatzgruppen were conducting throughout the summer of 1941, the phrase's meaning was not ambiguous to anyone familiar with that context. It was authorization for the planning and implementation of the systematic murder of the Jews of Europe. It was Nuremberg Exhibit 710-PS. It was signed by Emmy's husband at the desk in the office, where he worked. Emmy shared that office's world. The mechanism through which the final solution was implemented, once Heydrich had his authorization and had convened the Wannsee Conference to coordinate the various agencies involved, was the most systematic and technologically sophisticated mass murder operation in human history. The deportation trains, the railway network redirected to carry human beings in sealed freight cars to the east rather than goods, operated across the entire territory of German-occupied Europe. From France, from Belgium, from the Netherlands, from Greece, from Italy, from Hungary, from all the countries of the Nazi Empire and its satellite states, Jewish families were rounded up by German authorities and their local collaborators, assembled at collection points, loaded onto trains and transported to the death camps of occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. At Auschwitz alone, approximately 1.1 million people were murdered, the vast majority of them Jews. At Treblinka, approximately 700,000 to 900,000 Jews were killed between July 1942 and October 1943. The total death toll of the Holocaust, the 6 million figure that is burned into historical consciousness, represents individual human lives that were ended by the system that Göring's signature had authorized. Emmy was Göring's wife throughout the period during which this system was being organized and operated. She lived in his houses and ate at his table. She hosted the dinners at which the regime's senior figures, some of them directly involved in the administration of the final solution, gathered for conversation and food and the social pleasures that Carinhall provided. She continued to receive the art that the looting apparatus was generating, continued to wear the jewellery that the dispossession of Jewish families had placed in Göring's hands, and from his hands into hers. She continued to play her role as the First Lady of a regime that was, during this period, committing the most extreme crime in modern history. What did she know? The question has been asked many times, and the honest answer is that she knew enough. She may not have known the specific operational details of the death camps, their precise locations, their precise methods, their precise capacity. This specific operational knowledge was closely guarded, shared on a need-to-know basis within the SS apparatus that ran the extermination program. But she knew, because it was impossible not to know, that the Jews of Germany and of occupied Europe were disappearing. She had watched, over the preceding years, the progressive stripping of Jewish citizens of their rights, their economic position, their freedom of movement, and finally, their physical presence in German cities. The deportations from Berlin, which began in significant numbers in October 1941 and continued through 1942 and beyond, were visible to anyone who walked the streets of the capital. The German Red Cross, in which Margaret Himmler was active and which connected Emmy's social world with information about conditions in the East, was aware of what was happening. The rumours and more than rumours that circulated through the world of the Nazi elite, carried by soldiers on leave and by officials with Eastern assignments, were available to Emmy if she chose to hear them. She chose not to. This is the most precise description of her moral position. Not ignorance, but chosen not knowing. The deliberate maintenance of a state of comfortable uncertainty that allowed her to continue enjoying a life that an honest engagement with the available information would have made untenable. This is a recognizable human capacity, the ability to not know things that one does not want to know, but it is not a moral defense. It is a moral failure, and in the context of the crimes being committed around her, it is a moral failure of the highest seriousness. Hermann Göring's trajectory through the final years of the war was one of sustained decline from the heights of power and prestige that he had occupied in the regime's early years, a decline that Emmy watched from close proximity and that she must have understood, whatever she later claimed about her isolation from the political realities of the court. The Battle of Britain had been the first crack in the edifice. The Stalingrad catastrophe had been a structural failure, and the subsequent course of the war in 1943 and 1944 continued to erode Göring's position, his influence, and ultimately his personal relationship with Hitler, from which all his authority ultimately derived. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against German cities, which began in earnest in 1942 and accelerated dramatically through 1943 as American daylight bombing supplemented British night attacks, was the most visible and damaging expression of Göring's military failure. The Luftwaffe he had built and commanded, which had swept across Poland and France and Britain in the early years of the war with a dominance that seemed to validate every claim made for its superiority, was by 1943 unable to mount effective defence of the German homeland against the Allied bombers. German cities, including Hamburg, Göring's own capital of Berlin, Cologne, Frankfurt, Dresden, and dozens of others, were subjected to devastating area bombing attacks that killed tens of thousands of civilians, destroyed millions of dwelling units, and disrupted the industrial and transportation infrastructure on which the war economy depended. Göring's assurance, made in the triumphant early months of the war, that no enemy aircraft would ever reach the cities of Germany, had become a bitter joke among the German public, who were sheltering in bomb cellars while Allied aircraft flew overhead with impunity. Hitler's response to this failure was increasingly open contempt, expressed in the tirades that the Führer directed at Göring in the military conferences at which Göring's declining Luftwaffe was the subject of discussion. Participants in these conferences recorded that Hitler's criticisms of Göring became progressively more savage and more public, a form of humiliation that Göring bore with varying degrees of dignity depending on the occasion. The man who had been the second most powerful figure in the Third Reich, who had been designed as Hitler's successor and who had held that designation for years, was being publicly diminished by the man whose system of patronage had made him everything he was. Göring's response was to retreat increasingly into the private world of Carinhall, into the art and the hunting and the household that Emmy managed, into the drugs that had never entirely released their hold on him. The morphine dependency, which Göring had first developed in the aftermath of the beer hall putsch wound, and which had supposedly been treated during various periods of his post-war life, had reasserted itself under the pressures of the war's final years. He was consuming substantial quantities of paracodeine, a morphine derivative, daily by the war's later stages, a dependency that affected his concentration, his energy, his physical appearance, and his capacity for the kind of sustained, focused work that his various official positions nominally required. He grew enormously fat, the physical excess becoming a satirical target for Allied propagandists who published caricatures of a bloated figure draped in medals and finery. He accumulated titles and uniforms and decorations with the compulsive intensity of a man trying to compensate, through external markers of status, for the internal experience of power slipping away. Emmy watched all of this. She managed the household around it, she maintained the social calendar and the appearance of normality that the Carinhall world required, even as the world beyond Carinhall's borders was in increasing catastrophe. The physical dismantlement of Carinhall began well before the military situation made it absolutely necessary. As the Allied bombing campaign extended its reach to include targets across Germany, including the area northeast of Berlin, where Carinhall was located, Göring's art specialists began the systematic transfer of the collection's most important works to more protected locations. The Austrian salt mines at Altaussee, near Salzburg, where the stable underground conditions of temperature and humidity made them ideal for the preservation of delicate works on canvas and panel, became the primary storage destination for the finest pieces of the Göring collection. Specially fitted railway wagons carried the works south in carefully supervised conditions, packed in purpose-designed cases and crates, and accompanied by the documentation necessary to maintain their organization and accessibility. The logistics of this operation were considerable, and they were coordinated by Hofer and Göring's other art administrators with the thoroughness appropriate to a collection of this quality and value. By the time the last pieces were loaded onto the trains to Austria, Carinhall was a shell of the extraordinary establishment it had been at its peak. The walls that had displayed the finest stolen masterpieces in Europe were empty. The cases that had held the decorative arts were cleared. The great hall that had hosted the dinners of the Nazi elite stood silent. Emmy's world was being packed into boxes, and the boxes were being sent south toward a refuge that itself would shortly fall into Allied hands. The end, when it came with the speed that characterized the entire final collapse of the Nazi state. Hitler's last weeks in the Berlin bunker, from mid-April to the Soviet capture of the city in late April and early May 1945, produced a series of desperate and in some cases surreal decisions as the Führer confronted the total failure of everything he had built and commanded. Göring's telegram of April 23rd, asking whether he should assume leadership of the Reich if Hitler was unable to leave Berlin, was the trigger for the final break between the two men. Bormann's manipulation of Hitler's response, the arrest order, the stripping of Göring's titles and positions were the final acts of the inner circle's self-destruction. The man who had been for 12 years the second most powerful individual in Germany ended the war as a prisoner of his own regime, held under SS guard at Obersalzberg, while the Allied forces closed in from all directions. American forces encountered Göring near Rastatt in Austria in the first days of May 1945, as the formal German surrender approached. He was transported to a proper holding facility, where the process of his physical and psychological preparation for the trial that would follow began. The morphine was removed. The weight began to come off. The man who emerged from the process of withdrawal and careful American custody was recognizably the intelligent and formidable figure who had survived the beer hall putsch and the exile and the political wilderness of the late 1920s, rather than the bloated and narcotic-hazed figure of the war's final years. He was going to stand trial for his life, and he was going to do it with everything he had. Emmy, meanwhile, was moving through Bavaria in the chaos of the final days, keeping Edda safe and trying to maintain the practical arrangements of daily life in a country in complete collapse. She was taken into Allied custody in the aftermath of the surrender and held while interrogations proceeded. The extraordinary world of Carinhall was gone forever. The Nuremberg trial, which opened on November 20th, 1945, in the Palace of Justice in the city that had hosted the Nazi Party rallies of the regime's triumphant years, was a proceeding of genuine historical significance, the first time in history that an international legal tribunal had tried individuals for crimes against peace and against humanity on the scale that the Nazi leadership had committed. The choice of Nuremberg was deliberate and symbolic. The same city where Hitler had staged his great annual theatrical demonstrations of Nazi power was now the site where that power's human instruments were being called to account. The courtroom itself, rebuilt after bomb damage and equipped with the simultaneous translation system that allowed proceedings to be conducted in German, English, French, and Russian, was a space designed to the function of historical reckoning. Göring in the Nuremberg dock was a figure that surprised many observers. The man who entered the courtroom in October 1945, having shed more than 60 pounds during the months of American custody and the supervised morphine withdrawal, was alert, sharply dressed in a Luftwaffe uniform stripped of its medals and possessed of a focused intelligence that his drug-affected state in the final years of the war had obscured. He had been studying the indictment and the available evidence with great care, consulting with his defense counsel Dr. Otto Stamer, and developing a strategy for the courtroom that was, given the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him, more about shaping the historical record than about achieving acquittal. His strategy had several components. First, he sought to defend the legitimacy of Hitler's government as a sovereign state pursuing its legitimate national interests, arguing that decisions about war and peace were within the sovereign authority of governments and not subject to international legal review by the victorious powers in a subsequent tribunal. This was the attack on the principle of the tribunal itself, the argument that victor's justice was no justice at all and that the legal basis for prosecuting crimes against peace was retrospective lawmaking. He knew this argument was unlikely to succeed in the immediate context of the trial, but he wanted it on the historical record. Second, he sought to deny personal responsibility for the specific crimes charged wherever the evidence allowed him any handhold, arguing that decisions had been made by Hitler alone and that Göring had implemented them in his official capacity as a servant of a legitimate government. Third, he sought to shift responsibility onto dead colleagues, particularly Heinrich Himmler, who had died by cyanide in British custody in May 1945, and who could not defend himself against attributions of responsibility. The prosecution confronted him with the evidence. The July 31st, 1941 document bearing his signature was produced and its significance explained. His response, developed with Stamer, was to argue that the document was a formality, an administrative coordination measure that did not authorize mass murder, but merely directed Heydrich to prepare plans, and that the subsequent implementation of those plans was Himmler's responsibility rather than his own. The argument was legally creative but historically untenable. The document was what it was, and the context of its signing made its meaning clear. The ERR records were produced, documenting the looting of art collections across occupied Europe under his direction. He tried to argue that the purchases had been legitimate transactions, that adequate compensation had been provided, that the claims of Jewish families to have been robbed were exaggerated. Rose Valland's records, which the French prosecution team introduced into evidence, made this argument impossible to sustain. The Kristallnacht meeting transcript was produced, and the collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks was documented in his own words. The records of the Gestapo's founding were produced. Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor and a Supreme Court justice, conducted the primary cross-examination of Göring, and the exchanges between them were the most dramatically compelling moments of the entire trial. Göring was a genuinely formidable adversary in the witness box, quick to correct imprecisions in Jackson's questions, resistant to the leading question technique that the American attorney had deployed so effectively with other witnesses, and capable of using long and detailed answers to redirect the emphasis of an exchange away from the prosecution's preferred terrain. Jackson, who was less familiar with the German documentary record than some of the British and French prosecutors, occasionally found himself outmaneuvered in specific exchanges. But the evidence itself was not susceptible to Göring's rhetorical management, and when Jackson or his colleagues were working directly from the documentary record, rather than from general questions about policy and intention, Göring's options for effective resistance were limited. The verdict, delivered on October 1, 1946, found Göring guilty on all 4 counts of the indictment: conspiracy to wage aggressive war, waging aggressive war, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out on October 16, 1946. He had 15 days. He spent them in his cell, receiving visits, writing letters, maintaining the performance of composure and dignity that he had sustained throughout the trial. Emmy visited. They said their goodbyes. What passed between them in those final meetings, what she said to him about their life and about the verdict and about what was coming, is not recorded in any source that has survived. The private reality of their final conversations remains unknown. On the evening of October 15th, the night before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring bit down on the glass cyanide capsule that had somehow survived every search of his cell and his person during the months of his detention. The capsule crushed between his teeth, releasing the cyanide into his system, and within minutes, he was dead. The American guards discovered his body at 10:45 in the evening. The hangman arrived the next morning to find the dock at Nuremberg with one vacant place. The origin of the cyanide capsule is one of the enduring minor mysteries of the post-war period. A number of theories have been proposed over the decades: that a trusted American officer provided it to him, motivated by a complex mixture of sympathy and the desire to spare Göring the indignity of the gallows; that it was concealed in a pen or some other object that had accompanied him through multiple searches without being detected; that it had been with him since his initial capture and had simply gone undetected; that Emmy or Edda had found a way to smuggle it to him during one of their visits. None of these theories has been conclusively established. Emmy, when asked, consistently denied knowledge of how the cyanide reached her husband, and there is no credible evidence to contradict that denial. The mystery remains open. The denazification proceedings that Emmy faced in the immediate post-war period were conducted within a broader institutional framework that was, by the time her case was heard, already showing the strains and compromises that would eventually lead to the general assessment that denazification had been inadequate to the scale of the crimes it was meant to address. The Allied Control Commission's denazification program had been established with serious intentions: to assess the degree of each German's involvement in the Nazi regime, to exclude those significantly involved from positions of public authority and influence, and to ensure that some proportion of those responsible for the regime's crimes faced appropriate consequences. The program classified individuals into 5 categories, ranging from major offenders through offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and the exonerated. In practice, the program faced systematic difficulties that undermined its effectiveness. The sheer number of people who needed to be assessed was overwhelming. Millions of Germans had been members of the Nazi Party, the SS, the SA, and the various other organizations of the regime, and assessing the degree of each individual's involvement and culpability was a task that exceeded the resources available. The German courts and tribunals that eventually took over much of the proceedings from the Allied authorities were operating in a society where most of the jurors, judges, and witnesses were themselves former participants in the regime in various degrees, creating structural incentives toward leniency. The practice of exchanging character testimonials, the so-called Persilschein system, named after the laundry detergent because the certificates whitewashed their recipients, became so widespread as to undermine much of the program's effectiveness. Former Nazis vouched for each other's good character and limited involvement with the ease of people who understood that their own similar certificates might soon be required in return. Emmy's specific case before the Denazification Tribunal involved evidence that was, by any reasonable standard, overwhelming in its indication of a high degree of complicity. She had been the central social figure of the Nazi regime's most powerful figure, after Hitler himself. She had lived for a decade in the regime's most extraordinary private residence, surrounded by stolen art and entertained by the regime's senior figures. Her husband's signature was on the authorization of the final solution. Her household had operated with the resources and in some cases with the personnel of the regime's criminal apparatus. Yet the tribunal found her in the relatively mild Nazi category, rather than in the more serious offender or major offender categories, and sentenced her to 1 year in prison and a 30% asset confiscation. The inadequacy of this outcome was noted by critics at the time and has been documented extensively by historians since. After her release from the year's imprisonment, Emmy returned to private life in Munich with the resources that the remaining 70% of her assets provided, the social connections that the Nazi elite's network continued to maintain despite the regime's collapse, and the determination to tell her own story in her own way when the time was right. The story she eventually told in the memoir published in 1966 was the story of a devoted wife and loving mother caught up in circumstances beyond her control. A woman who had loved her husband and stood by him through the extraordinary and ultimately catastrophic adventure of his public career. It was a story carefully crafted to be sympathetic, and for readers willing to engage with it on its own terms rather than against the backdrop of the historical record, it was not without human appeal. Emmy had genuine warmth and genuine intelligence, and these qualities came through in her writing. What did not come through, and what she had evidently decided would not come through, was any honest accounting of what she had known and when she had known it, and what she had chosen to do with that knowledge. The Munich in which Emmy spent the last 2 decades of her life was rebuilding itself with the pragmatic energy that characterized West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s and early 1960s that transformed a bombed-out and morally bankrupt country into one of the most prosperous and stable democracies in Europe. The reconstruction had a physical dimension that was visible in the new buildings rising from the rubble of the bombed city, and a cultural and political dimension that was less visible but equally important: the construction of a new West German identity that acknowledged the Nazi past in formally appropriate ways, while making it possible to live with that past without being destroyed by it. This involved, inevitably, a considerable degree of what later historians would call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the working through of the past, a process that was often more about managing the past than genuinely confronting it. Emmy managed her past in the most private way available. She simply declined to discuss it honestly, living out her days in Munich surrounded by whatever remained of the social world that had survived the regime's collapse, maintaining relationships with people who shared her history and her silence about it, watching her daughter grow up and pursue her various campaigns to rehabilitate the Göring name, and reading the increasing body of historical scholarship about the Nazi era with whatever combination of defensiveness and occasional recognition the documents and the testimonies and the analysis produced in her. She died on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80 years and 76 days in the apartment on Prinzregentenstraße, quietly and without great public notice, 28 years after the end of the regime, whose first lady she had been. Emmy Göring's life deserves extended consideration in any account of Emmy's story because Edda was both the most intimate witness of Emmy's choices and the most direct human consequence of those choices. A child born into the most extraordinary circumstances of privilege and complicity that Nazi Germany could create, and condemned to spend her entire subsequent life managing the impossible inheritance of her parentage. She was born on June 2, 1938, at the height of the regime's power and prosperity, celebrated with 500 aircraft and the personal attention of the Führer, who was her godfather, and she died on December 21, 2018, at the age of 80, having spent 8 decades carrying the name Göring, in a world that had spent those same 8 decades trying to understand and account for what her father had done. Her early childhood, before the war changed everything and the war's end changed it still more completely, was spent in the extraordinary environment of Carinhall and the other Göring residences, tended by nurses and governesses and household staff of the quality appropriate to the child of the regime's most prominent figure. She was photographed regularly, the small blonde girl used as a prop of domestic normalcy in the Nazi propaganda apparatus's ongoing effort to present the leadership as wholesome family men with ordinary human feelings and relatable private lives. She was present at social events at Carinhall, meeting as a small child the figures who occupied the summit of the regime's hierarchy, generals and ministers and diplomats who addressed her parents with deference and who regarded the small child of the house with the attention appropriate to her father's position. Her early world was one in which the conditions of Carinhall were simply the natural order of things, in which abundance and privilege and deference and beauty were simply what life was, because she had no experience of any other kind of life. The collapse of this world, which came with the speed and totality of the Nazi regime's final destruction in 1945, was an experience that defined Edda's psychology and personality in ways that the subsequent 8 decades only reinforced, rather than resolved. She was 6 years old when the war ended, when her father was arrested and her mother taken into Allied custody, when the great estate of Carinhall was blown up and the art collection was seized and the household staff dispersed, and the extraordinary material world of her childhood was simply gone. She was 7 years old when her father stood trial at Nuremberg, when the evidence of his crimes was presented to the world in the most thorough and documented form possible, when the verdict came and the sentence was delivered. She was 7.5 years old when her father died in his cell the night before his execution, the cyanide capsule ending the life that the Allies' rope was to have taken. These are the formative experiences of Emmy Göring's psychological life, and they happened before she was 8 years old. Emmy managed the aftermath of these events with what the available evidence suggests was a combination of genuine maternal protectiveness toward Edda and a sustained determination to shape Edda's understanding of her father's legacy in the most favourable possible terms. In Emmy's account of things, communicated to Edda through the years of their life together, Hermann Göring was a great man who had been unfairly condemned by a victor's justice that lacked the authority and the impartiality to judge him fairly. The evidence presented at Nuremberg was, in Emmy's telling, manipulated or exaggerated or taken out of context. The document of July 31st, 1941 was an administrative formality misinterpreted by hostile prosecutors. The art collection was legitimately assembled through purchases and gifts. The household had been no different from the households of other senior officials of a government that, whatever its errors and excesses, had been a legitimate sovereign state, pursuing Germany's legitimate national interest. Edda absorbed these explanations and made them her own, adding to them the fierce personal loyalty of a daughter who had never known her father as an adult, and who had consequently never had the opportunity to confront him with the historical reality of what he had done. The legal campaigns that Edda pursued throughout her adult life to recover Göring assets or to establish claims based on her father's position were pursued with the tenacity and the legal creativity of a woman who believed genuinely in the justice of her cause. However, that belief had been shaped by the environment of her upbringing. In 1964, she successfully established her right to a pension as the daughter of a former official of the German state, a claim that had been contested on the grounds that the German state, whose official her father had been, no longer existed, and that the new Federal Republic bore no obligation to recognize the claims of the heirs of the Nazi government's personnel. The West German courts ultimately found in her favour on a technical legal basis, and the decision was controversial, with critics arguing that it amounted to a form of official recognition of the Göring family's claim to respectability that the historical record did not support. She pursued various other claims over the subsequent decades with varying results, none of them fully successful in material terms and all of them contributing to the maintenance of a public profile for the Göring name that Emmy's more private existence had not required. Emmy Göring died on December 21, 2018 at her home in Munich at the age of 80. She died unmarried, without children, the last direct descendant of Hermann and Emmy Göring. Her death attracted modest international press coverage, most of it noting the irony of the 80-year span of her life, the distance between the world of her birth and the world of her death, and the consistency with which she had maintained to the end her defense of her father's reputation against the weight of the historical evidence. She was buried quietly, and the Göring line ended with her. The restitution of Nazi-looted art, the ongoing process through which works stolen from Jewish families and other victims of the Nazi regime are identified, claimed and returned to their original owners or heirs, is one of the most significant and most complicated legacies of the crimes that Emmy Göring lived with so comfortably. The process began in the immediate post-war period, when Allied art investigators working with the documentation produced by Rose Valland and by the ERR's own records began the systematic identification of works that had been stolen and their preparation for return. But the immediate post-war restitution efforts, though substantial in their scope, were far from comprehensive, and works continued to surface in unexpected locations for decades afterward. The scale of the challenge was immense. The ERR alone had processed and distributed tens of thousands of individual objects across the occupied territories of Western Europe. The parallel looting operations conducted by other Nazi agencies in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, in Greece and Yugoslavia, and the other territories of German occupation added tens of thousands more. The total number of individual cultural objects stolen by the Nazi regime and its agencies has been estimated by various authorities at between 500,000 and more than 1 million individual items, a figure so large that its full accounting and restitution may never be possible. Against this background, the portion that passed through the Göring collection and through the hands of Emmy Göring is a subset of a larger catastrophe, but it is a subset that is unusually well documented and that consequently provides a basis for specific and concrete restitution claims. The Washington Principles of 1998, agreed upon by 44 countries at a U.S. conference on Nazi confiscated art, established a framework for the identification and return of looted works that had been influential in reshaping the practices of museums, auction houses, and governments in relation to provenance research. The principles called for the examination of the provenance of art held in public and institutional collections for the period between 1933 and 1945, and for the resolution of ownership questions raised by that examination through mechanisms that were just and fair to both current holders and to original owners or their heirs. The implementation of these principles has been uneven across different countries and different types of institutions, but the principles themselves have been a significant force in changing the culture of the art world's engagement with the looted art question. Works that passed through the Göring collection have been identified in the inventories of major museums in the United States and Europe, in significant private collections assembled in the post-war decades and in the international art market at various points over the past 80 years. Each identification triggers a process of provenance research, consultation with claimant families or their representatives, negotiation, and in some cases, litigation. The families seeking return of these works are, in many cases, the heirs of people who were murdered in the Holocaust, families who survived the genocide but who lost parents and grandparents and other relatives along with the objects that those relatives had owned. The art represents not only monetary value but connection to family history, to cultural identity, to the physical remains of lives that the Holocaust destroyed. Emmy enjoyed these objects while their original owners were being murdered. Their heirs, or in many cases the organizations representing heirs who no longer exist, are still pursuing their return. The legacy of Emmy Göring, considered from the distance of more than 80 years and with access to a historical record that is more comprehensive than anything available to the contemporaries who try to assess her, is a complex and troubling one that resists reduction to simple moral categories. She was not a murderer in the sense that the Nuremberg defendants were murderers. She did not sign death orders or organize deportations or command units that killed people. Her crimes were, in the formal legal sense, crimes of complicity and benefit rather than crimes of direct perpetration, which is one reason why the Denazification Tribunal's inadequate verdict was the sum total of the legal accounting she faced. But the inadequacy of the legal framework doesn't mean that the moral accounting is uncertain. History has the capacity to see what the law could not adequately capture. Emmy Göring chose deliberately and with full awareness to pursue a relationship with one of the founding architects of the Nazi state, at a moment when the state's character was already clear. She chose to marry him in 1935, after 2 years of Nazi governance during which the Gestapo had been established, the concentration camps had been opened, and the systematic persecution of the Jewish population had been institutionalized in law and practice. She chose to embrace her role as the social centerpiece of the regime, with the full professional skill at her disposal. She chose to live in the houses filled with stolen art, to wear the confiscated jewelry, to host the dinners of the men who were organizing and executing the final solution. She chose to write a memoir that sanitized all of this, that substituted comfortable private life for honest public reckoning. These choices have consequences, and those consequences extend into the present. The broader question that Emmy Göring's story raises, and that it raises more sharply than most comparable cases precisely because of the scale of what she enjoyed, and the clarity with which the historical record documents her enjoyment, is the question of what constitutes meaningful complicity in historical crimes of the first order. This is not merely a historical question. It is a question with immediate contemporary relevance, because the mechanisms through which ordinary and even cultivated and intelligent people choose comfortable, not knowing over morally demanding knowledge are not specific to the Nazi era, but are features of human social psychology that operate in every era and in every society. The comfortable not knowing that Emmy practiced in Carinhall is recognizable to anyone who has ever chosen not to examine too closely the supply chain of the consumer goods they enjoy, the political processes that maintain their comfortable social position, or the human costs of the economic arrangements from which they benefit. Emmy's version of this universal human tendency was simply more extreme and more consequential than most. The question of whether Emmy Göring was a bad person in some deep personal sense is less interesting and less important than the question of what she did and what the consequences of what she did were. She was, by the testimony of people who knew her, capable of personal warmth, of genuine affection for her daughter, of real cultural engagement and aesthetic sensitivity, of the ordinary human kindnesses that make people pleasant to know. None of this is incompatible with the choices she made and the crimes those choices enabled. The point of the historical record is not that Emmy Göring was uniquely evil, but that she was recognizably human in her capacity for self-deception and her preference for comfort over honesty, and that this recognizably human capacity, exercised in a specific historical context and at a specific social level, had consequences that were neither recognizably human in scale nor forgettable in impact. She was 80 years old when she died in Munich on June 8, 1973. The city around her was prosperous, rebuilt, democratic, a place that bore almost no visible trace of the decade that had produced Carinhall and the First Lady of the Third Reich. The art that had hung on Carinhall's walls was dispersed, some returned, some not yet returned, some in legal dispute, some absorbed into institutional collections, some in private hands where its provenance was not examined closely. The people whose possessions had filled those walls were mostly dead, murdered in the system that Emmy's husband's signature had authorized and that Emmy's social performance had helped to sustain and normalize. The First Lady's performance was over. The curtain had come down. What remained was the historical record, incomplete but extensive, honest where Emmy had not been, specific where she had preferred the general, clear where she had preferred the obscure. To understand the full weight of what Emmy Goring chose, it is worth returning to the world she came from before any of this began, because the contrast between her origins and her destination is itself one of the most instructive elements of her story. Emmy Sonnemann was born on March 24, 1893 in Hamburg, the same year as her future husband, a coincidence that later biographers would sometimes note as if it suggested some fated symmetry between two lives that would collide so catastrophically with history. Hamburg in the 1890s was a prosperous cosmopolitan port city, Germany's great gateway to the world, a place of commercial confidence and bourgeois culture, where the arts were valued and supported, and where a young woman of respectable family might reasonably aspire to a life on the stage. Emmy's father was a merchant, her family comfortable without being wealthy, their world defined by the solid respectability of the Wilhelmina middle class. There was music in the household, theatre, the expectation that culture was part of a decent life. None of this made Emmy unusual. It made her representative of a certain kind of educated German woman of her generation, the generation that would come of age during the catastrophe of the First World War and navigate the dizzying instability of the Weimar Republic before arriving at the crossroads that Germany presented in the early 1930s. Emmy's decision to pursue the stage was not scandalous, but it was ambitious. The German theatrical world of the early 20th century was one of the most sophisticated in Europe, and the training required to succeed in it was rigorous and demanding. She studied at theatre schools in Hamburg and Munich, learning not merely the technical skills of voice and movement and projection, but the interpretive arts that distinguished a competent performer from a genuine actress. She was, by the accounts of those who worked with her in the years before her marriage, talented, disciplined, and possessed of a stage presence that audiences found compelling. The roles she took were classical, the repertoire of Schiller and Goethe and the great German dramatic tradition, the kind of work that positioned an actress as a serious artist rather than a popular entertainer. She was deeply serious about her craft, and she was good at it. Her career took her eventually to Weimar, that city whose name would become synonymous with the democratic experiment that preceded Nazism, and it was there that she found her professional home for the most significant years of her pre-marriage life. The Deutsches Nationaltheater in Weimar was one of Germany's most prestigious regional theatres, a house with historical weight and artistic ambition, and Emmy's position there as a leading actress meant that she was not a peripheral figure in German cultural life, but a recognised presence in it. She played Gretchen in Faust and Elizabeth in Mary Stuart and other demanding classical roles that required genuine command of the German dramatic tradition. She received reviews that praised her natural warmth, her vocal intelligence, her ability to convey emotional truth without melodramatic excess. She was, in the estimation of the Weimar theatrical world, a real actress, not merely a pretty face or a personality, but someone who had mastered her art. It was through this professional world that she met Hermann Göring. The exact circumstances of their first encounter in 1931 have been described in slightly different ways by different sources, but the essentials are consistent. Göring attended a performance at the theatre, was introduced to the leading actress afterward, and was immediately and powerfully attracted to her. For Emmy's part, the attraction was real too, however tangled it might have been with the social excitement of meeting one of the most prominent political figures in the rising Nazi movement. Göring at this point was not yet the corpulent, medal-festooned caricature of his later years. He was a decorated war hero, a man of evident physical vitality and social force, someone who moved through rooms as if he owned them, someone whose company was socially significant. For an actress, even a well-regarded one, the attentions of such a man carried their own kind of weight. Emmy's first marriage had ended, and she was free to pursue this new relationship. The courtship was conducted across the early years of the Nazi seizure of power, which means that Emmy was watching, close at hand, the transformation of German political life in real time, watching the Nazi movement move from parliamentary force to governing coalition to absolute dictatorship over the course of barely 2 years. She watched the Reichstag fire in February 1933 and the subsequent suspension of civil liberties. She watched the passage of the Enabling Act in March 1933 that gave Hitler dictatorial powers. She watched the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, when Göring himself was deeply involved in the murder of political rivals, including Ernst Röhm and dozens of others. She watched as her future husband built and led the Gestapo, the secret state police force whose methods of interrogation and detention were already well known in the circles where she moved. She watched all of this, and she said, yes. This is the context that Emmy's memoir carefully avoids examining. The question of what she knew and when she knew it, and what she concluded from what she knew. The memoir presents her life in the Nazi years as a kind of domestic fairy tale, a woman who loved her husband and enjoyed her beautiful homes, and took pleasure in the cultural life that her social position made available to her. A woman for whom the political world her husband occupied was something external to her own experience, something that happened in offices and military headquarters and conference rooms that she did not visit and could not be held responsible for. This framing, while psychologically understandable as a defensive strategy, is historically untenable. Emmy was not an ignorant person. She was an educated, artistically sophisticated woman who had spent her professional life interpreting complex human motivations and who was, by all accounts, acutely perceptive in personal interactions. The idea that this woman, living at the very centre of the Nazi power structure, entertaining its most senior figures at her dinner table, attending its state functions, living in its stolen palaces, was genuinely unaware of the nature of the regime she was so intimately part of is simply not credible. What Emmy knew about the 4-year plan, for instance, is a question that deserves serious consideration, because it was the 4-year plan that most directly translated into the material world that Emmy inhabited every day. Hermann Göring was appointed by Hitler as plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan in October 1936, giving him sweeping authority over the German economy and making him the second most powerful man in the Reich. The 4-year plan was ostensibly about preparing the German economy for war, but its practical implementation involved the systematic exploitation of Jewish-owned businesses through a process of forced sale at a fraction of their real value, known as Aryanization. It involved the systematic use of forced labour, first from concentration camp prisoners and later from the populations of occupied territories across Europe. It involved the plunder of the economies of conquered countries to feed the German war machine. And it involved the coordination of economic policy with racial policy in ways that made the Holocaust not merely possible, but practically inevitable. Emmy lived surrounded by the products of this system. The servants who maintained Carinhall and the other properties did not all come from the ranks of freely employed German workers. The foreign labourers who were brought into the German economy under coercion and sometimes at gunpoint were not abstract economic statistics, but people whose labour produced the goods and maintained the infrastructure that made the life of the First Lady of the Third Reich possible. The stolen art that hung on Carinhall's walls was not merely aesthetically pleasing, but morally freighted in a way that Emmy chose not to examine. Every painting by a Dutch master, every piece of French Impressionism, every medieval tapestry that decorated the rooms where Emmy entertained guests and raised her daughter was there because its previous owner had been dispossessed, fled, or murdered. This was not a secret. It was the explicit purpose of the ERR operations that Göring directed with such personal enthusiasm. The diplomatic functions that Emmy hosted during the pre-war years deserve particular attention, because they illuminate the specific social role she played in the regime's self-presentation to the outside world. These were not mere dinner parties, they were political operations conducted in the social register, occasions at which the regime sought to project an image of sophistication and cultural depth to foreign observers whose governments were still uncertain how to respond to what was happening in Germany. Emmy was the instrument of this projection. She received ambassadors and their wives, cabinet ministers from Britain and France and Italy and Hungary, journalists and cultural figures whose favourable impressions would be transmitted to their home audiences. She was charming and cultured and spoke with evident knowledge about music and theatre and art, and she created around her husband a social world that suggested that whatever was happening in the political and racial sphere, the Nazi leadership was, at bottom, recognisably European, recognisably civilised, the kind of people that other civilised Europeans could do business with. The British ambassador Sir Neville Henderson, whose famous policy of appeasement made him one of the most controversial diplomatic figures of the era, was a frequent guest at the Göring social functions, and he consistently described Emmy in favourable terms, noting her gracious manner and apparent sincerity. The American journalist William Shirer, who was in Berlin throughout the Nazi period, and whose book Berlin Diary would become one of the essential contemporary accounts of the era, observed the social world of the Nazi elite with the sharp eye of a reporter who understood what he was seeing, and even he noted that Emmy occupied her role with a kind of professional competence that made her effective precisely because she seemed so genuinely warm, rather than merely performatively so. This effectiveness was the point. Emmy was not just decorating her husband's social world, she was actively working it, and the results of that work had real political consequences. The Italian foreign minister, Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law and one of the most important diplomatic figures in the Axis relationship, attended the Göring's functions on multiple occasions and recorded his impressions in a diary that has since become an important historical source. Ciano was himself a sophisticated observer of political theatre and not easily impressed by social performance, and yet he found Carinhall genuinely remarkable, both as a physical environment and as a social occasion. This kind of impression, repeated across dozens of visiting dignitaries from countries across Europe and beyond, served the regime's interests in ways that were not trivial. Emmy's stage training had given her the skills to perform convincingly under observation, and she applied those skills systematically to the most important political theatre of her life. One of the most revealing windows into Emmy's specific social world during the Nazi years is the network of relationships she maintained with the other senior Nazi wives, because these relationships illuminate both the internal social politics of the regime and the specific character of Emmy's position within it. The wives of the senior Nazis formed a kind of court with all the hierarchical complexity and interpersonal tension that courts throughout history have displayed, and Emmy's self-claimed position at the top of this hierarchy was a source of constant friction and negotiation. Magda Goebbels was perhaps the most formidable of the other Nazi wives, a woman of genuine political sophistication whose relationship with Goebbels himself was turbulent and painful, but who maintained her public persona with a disciplined professionalism that Emmy could recognise as a fellow performer. Magda was beautiful in the cool, Nordic way that Nazi aesthetic preferred, and she was committed to the regime with an intensity that went beyond her husband's relationship and had its own ideological roots. The relationship between Emmy and Magda was correct but not warm. Two women of strong personality and clear understanding of the social stakes, maintaining a working peace in the service of the regime's social image. Margaret Himmler occupied a very different position, being neither beautiful nor socially skilled in the way that Emmy and Magda were, and her relationship with the other senior wives was consistently difficult. Emmy, for her part, maintained the aristocratic condescension toward Margaret that characterized much of the senior Nazi social world's attitude toward Himmler himself, who was seen as socially peripheral despite his enormous institutional power. Lena Heydrich was younger and more openly aggressive in her social ambitions, and her relationship with Emmy was complicated by the professional relationship between their husbands, Göring and Heydrich being men of very different temperaments whose institutional interests frequently conflicted. The network of these relationships, and the social politics that structured them, was a world in which Emmy was a major player, and her navigation of it required exactly the kind of social intelligence and strategic thinking that was not available to someone who was genuinely naive about the nature of the world she inhabited. The question of what Emmy wore is not a trivial one because the jewellery that adorned her in official photographs and at official functions was not purchased from jewellers in the ordinary way. The confiscation of Jewish property under Nazi law extended to personal jewellery, and the documentation of what was taken from Jewish families deported to the camps includes extensive inventories of jewellery that entered the Nazi state's possession and was then distributed through various channels to the regime's senior figures and their families. Emmy's jewellery collection was famous for its size and magnificence, and while the specific provenance of individual pieces is difficult to establish in all cases, the general principle that much of what she wore had been taken from someone who had been dispossessed and murdered is not seriously in dispute among historians who have examined the records. She wore stolen lives on her fingers and around her neck and pinned to her gown, and she did so with the practiced elegance of a woman who had spent decades learning how to present herself to an audience. The fall of Carinhall in April 1945 was a genuinely dramatic event that Emmy witnessed firsthand, and its details illuminate the priorities of the Göring household, even in the final days of the Reich. The evacuation of the most valuable artworks began weeks before the final demolition, with special trains organised under Göring's personal direction to move the most important pieces to the Altaussee salt mines in Austria, where other senior Nazi officials were also storing their most prized possessions. The logistics of this operation were enormous. There were hundreds of paintings, dozens of pieces of sculpture, cases of jewellery, antique furniture, tapestries, medieval manuscripts, all requiring careful packing and specialised transport. Emmy was present for much of this process, overseeing the domestic aspects of the evacuation while Göring dealt with the military and logistical questions. She knew which pieces were most important and why, because she had lived with them for years and had heard Göring describe their acquisition with the pride of a collector who understood the market he was looting. The demolition of Carinhall itself, when it came, was Göring's personal decision, a refusal to allow the advancing Soviet forces to capture the estate and its contents. Engineering units loyal to Göring placed explosive charges throughout the building over several days, and Emmy watched from a distance as the structure that had defined her life for nearly a decade was reduced to rubble. The hunting trophies and the model railway and the Norse longhouse architecture and the grand reception rooms where she had received ambassadors and ministers and foreign dignitaries were destroyed methodically and completely. It was, by any standard, an extraordinary moment, a woman watching her world literally explode while the political system that had made that world possible collapsed around her. What Emmy felt in that moment she did not record with any specificity. The memoir glides past it with the practiced vagueness that characterises its treatment of all the most morally demanding moments. The Altaussee mines, where much of Carinhall's art had been evacuated, became one of the most significant sites of the Allied art recovery operation in the final months and immediate aftermath of the war. The Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives Programme, known as the Monuments Men, was the unit charged with identifying and recovering cultural property stolen by the Nazis, and Altaussee was one of their most important discoveries. When Allied investigators entered the mines in May 1945, they found thousands of artworks from across occupied Europe, including masterpieces that had been looted from museums and private collections in France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, and elsewhere. The records kept by Rose Vallon at the Jeu de Paume in Paris, records she had maintained at great personal risk throughout the German occupation, provided investigators with a crucial guide to what had been taken and from whom, and the Göring collection was specifically well documented because of Göring's personal involvement in selecting pieces and the administrative trail that his enthusiasm had left behind. The recovery and restitution of these works was, and remains, an enormously complex process. Some pieces were returned relatively quickly to their countries of origin or to their original owners or heirs. Others became entangled in legal and bureaucratic complications that persisted for decades. Still others ended up in museum collections where their provenance was not fully examined for many years, or in private collections where the wartime history of the piece was deliberately obscured. The Washington Principles on Nazi Confiscated Art, agreed to by 44 countries in 1998, established a framework for addressing these outstanding cases and committed signatory governments to making best efforts to identify and return art that had been confiscated during the Nazi period. But the implementation of these principles has been uneven, and many claims remain unresolved decades after the agreement was signed. The specific case of the Lucas Cranach the Elder painting, Madonna and Child, which had been given to Emmy Göring as a child, became one of the most publicly visible art restitution cases of the post-war decades. The painting had been taken from a Jewish collection in the Netherlands, and after the war it was among the Göring family's possessions that came under legal scrutiny. Emmy Göring, who had grown up with the painting and for whom it represented a personal connection to her childhood and her father, contested the restitution claims in German courts through the 1950s and 1960s. She ultimately lost the case in 1968, and the painting was returned to the heirs of its original owners. But the legal battle itself and Edda's willingness to fight it illuminated the way in which the next generation too had absorbed the idea that what the Görings had taken was legitimately theirs, that the acquisition of stolen property through the mechanisms of the Nazi state had created genuine ownership rights that the law should protect. Emmy's interrogation by Allied investigators in the months following Germany's surrender was a prolonged and sometimes contentious process. The Allied Control Council Law No. 10, which established the legal framework for prosecuting war criminals and their collaborators in occupied Germany, provided the basis for the denazification proceedings that ultimately resulted in Emmy's conviction, and the investigators who questioned her were thorough and persistent. Emmy's responses during these sessions, which were recorded and have been available to historians, follow a consistent pattern. She acknowledged the facts that were impossible to deny: the luxurious lifestyle, the presence of stolen art, the social functions she had hosted, the Nazi party membership, but she consistently framed these facts in ways that minimized her own agency and awareness. The art was Herman's business. She didn't ask questions about where it came from. The party membership was a gift she had not sought. The political decisions were made in rooms she did not enter. The crimes were committed by men she did not personally oversee. This was the defense that denazification courts across Germany heard from thousands of people who had participated at various levels in the regime, and in Emmy's case, as in so many others, it was found partially credible and partially not. The denazification court that convicted Emmy as a Nazi, rather than merely a profiteer of Nazism, made a distinction that has sometimes been underappreciated in later accounts. The higher category of Nazi activist, as opposed to the lower categories of lesser offender or follower, carried more serious consequences, and Emmy's conviction in this category reflected a judicial judgment that her role was not merely passive. The 1-year prison sentence, the seizure of 30% of her remaining wealth, and the 5-year ban on performing on stage were the practical consequences of this judgment. The prison sentence she served, the ban she observed. The wealth seizure was implemented according to the assets that remained after the post-war chaos, and the confiscations already carried out by Allied occupation authorities. What was left to Emmy after all of this was modest by any comparison with what she had enjoyed during the Nazi years, and the Munich apartment where she lived out the remaining decades of her life was a considerable reduction from the grandeur of Carinhall. The Munich where Emmy spent her post-war years was physically rebuilding from the devastating Allied bombing raids that had heavily damaged the city, and the social world of post-war Munich was one, defined by a collective effort to move forward without too closely examining what had come before. Emmy was not the only former senior Nazi figure living in relative obscurity in the city. Munich had been a centre of the Nazi movement from its earliest days, and many of the people who had held significant positions in the regime had connections there that made it a natural destination for those who were not imprisoned or executed. The social geography of post-war Munich included a network of former Nazis at various levels who knew each other from the old world and who maintained careful, quiet connections while presenting respectable public faces to the rebuilt democratic society around them. Emmy's relationship with Edda during these post-war years was complex and has not been fully documented. Edda was 7 years old when her father was executed, and the task of explaining the Nuremberg trial and its outcome to a young child whose understanding of her father was entirely formed by the life she had lived at Carinhall fell entirely to Emmy. What Emmy told her daughter about Hermann Göring, about his crimes, about the war and its causes and consequences, can be partially reconstructed from Edda's later public statements, which consistently defended her father's personal character, while acknowledging in the most general terms that there had been things wrong with the regime he served. This is the characteristic posture of second-generation complicity, the child who was not old enough to have made any choices but who inherits the parents' framework for understanding those choices and does not, until much later, if at all, develop an independent framework that might produce different conclusions. Edda's 1964 attempt to claim a pension from the West German government on the basis of her father's wartime service was one of the most publicly controversial moments of her post-war life. The West German pension system for the survivors of military and government service included provisions that extended to the families of men who had died in service or had been executed. And Edda's lawyers argued that Hermann Göring's execution at Nuremberg brought her within the scope of these provisions. The claim was rejected after public outcry, and the rejection reflected a political judgment that whatever the technical arguments might be about the pension law's scope, it was not appropriate for the daughter of one of the Third Reich's most powerful figures to receive public benefits based on that service. Emmy's response to the controversy was characteristically muted in public. Her private views, expressed in letters to Edda that have partially survived, were rather more indignant, as she continued to see her husband's execution as a judicial injustice rather than as the proper consequence of crimes that had been amply documented at trial. The question of Hermann Göring's cyanide capsule and how he obtained it has never been fully resolved, and the mystery added a final dramatic element to a life that had been theatrical throughout. The prosecution at Nuremberg, which had worked so hard to obtain his conviction and death sentence, found the successful suicide deeply humiliating, as it denied the spectacle of public execution and allowed Göring to exit on his own terms, rather than those of the International Tribunal. Subsequent investigations identified that the capsule had most likely been smuggled to him through one of several possible channels, including a sympathetic American officer whose identity was never definitively established. Emmy, who would have had the most direct personal interest in what happened, maintained that she knew nothing of how it had been accomplished, and her position on this question cannot be independently verified. What Emmy wrote in the pages of her 1966 autobiography about the Nuremberg trial is worth examining carefully, because the memoir's treatment of the trial is one of its most revealing sections. She presents her husband's defense strategy not as the calculated performance of a man who understood exactly what the prosecution evidence showed, but as the natural response of a patriotic officer defending his country's honor against an unjust proceeding. She describes the courtroom with the eye of a theatre professional, noting staging and performance, noting Göring's bearing and voice and the impression he made, acknowledging in an almost admiring way his skill at cross-examination as if she were reviewing a particularly effective dramatic performance. What she does not do, anywhere in the memoir, is grapple honestly with the substance of what was proven at the trial. The documentary record of Göring's crimes, including exhibits that bore his own signature, is treated in the memoir as something peripheral to the real story, which is the story of a husband defending himself against enemies. The memoir's publication in 1966, in German under the title An der Seite meines Mannes and in English translation as My Life with Göring, was received with the mixture of commercial interest and critical dismay that such books typically attract. There was clearly a readership for it, a generation of Germans who had lived through the Nazi years and for whom a sympathetic account of one of the regime's central figures carried a certain emotional resonance that was not necessarily connected to political sympathy, so much as to the human need to understand the familiar from inside. But reviewers who engaged with the memoir seriously found its evasions too systematic to ignore, and the scholarly consensus that formed around it in subsequent decades has been consistently critical of its failure to engage honestly with what Emmy had witnessed and participated in. The memoir is now used primarily as a document of the post-war effort to normalize and domesticate the Nazi experience, rather than as a reliable account of that experience itself. Emmy's life in the 1950s and 1960s, as she aged from her 60s into her 70s, was defined by the twin poles of her daughter and her memoir. Edda was the emotional center of her existence, the one relationship that had survived the destruction of everything else. And Emmy's investment in Edda's well-being was genuine and unambiguous. But this investment also meant that Emmy's narrative about the Nazi years was shaped in part by the need to give Edda a version of her father's life that was livable with, a version in which Emmy Göring was a man who had served his country and his family, and who had been unjustly condemned by victor's justice. Emmy was not unique among the senior Nazi wives in constructing this kind of narrative for her children. Magda Goebbels had avoided the problem by choosing death over survival, taking her children with her in the Führerbunker in what remains one of the most incomprehensible acts of the entire Nazi era. But those Nazi wives who did survive and who had children to raise faced the practical question of what to tell those children, and almost without exception they chose versions of the truth that protected the children's image of their fathers, rather than versions that would have required a more honest accounting. The theatre world that Emmy had left behind when she married Göring underwent its own complicated post-war reckoning. The German theatrical tradition was deeply implicated in the Nazi cultural programme, which had used theatre as an instrument of ideological formation and had rewarded directors, actors and playwrights who collaborated with the regime while driving Jewish artists into exile or death. The denazification of German cultural institutions was an uneven and often inadequate process, and many figures who had benefited from the Nazi cultural system returned to positions of prominence in the post-war German theatre world, with minimal examination of their wartime roles. Emmy's 5-year ban on performing, which was one of the consequences of her denazification conviction, expired before the end of the 1950s, but by that point her time for stage performance had effectively passed. She was past 60, the physical demands of the classical stage roles she had once played were beyond her, and the world of German theatre had moved on in ways that left no natural place for her. What Emmy's story ultimately illustrates, beyond its specific details of stolen art and diplomatic dinners and post-war evasions, is the way in which personal complicity in historical atrocity operates through the accumulation of ordinary choices. No single moment in Emmy's story is the decisive one, the point at which she crossed an absolute moral line. Instead, there is a long series of decisions, each individually explicable as the natural choice of a woman who loved her husband and wanted to maintain the good things in her life, that collectively added up to a profound moral failure. She chose to stay with Göring as the Gestapo was established and that concentration camps were opened. She chose to enjoy Carinhall's stolen art while knowing, at whatever level of explicitness she permitted herself to know, that it had not been freely sold. She chose to host the state functions that gave the regime's most senior figures a veneer of civilized normality. She chose to write a memoir that prioritized her own comfort over historical honesty. Each of these choices was, in isolation, the choice of a human being, protecting herself and those she loved. Taken together, they constitute a life lived in fundamental moral evasion. The historical record of Emmy Göring's life is, at this point, more than adequate for the moral judgment that the record demands. She was not the most powerful figure in the Third Reich, she was not the architect of its policies, and she did not personally give orders that resulted in murder. But she was present, she was implicated, she benefited massively and specifically and in full knowledge of the general, if not the exact nature of the crimes that generated her benefits, and she spent the decades after the regime's fall working actively to obscure and minimize that implication. This is a particular kind of moral failing. Not the failing of the person who does evil, but the failing of the person who enables evil and then pretends not to have done so, and it is in some ways more insidious precisely because it is more recognizable and more available to more people. The path Emmy Göring walked was not available to most people, but the psychological dynamics that made it walkable are not historically specific. They are human, and their humanity is part of what makes her story worth studying. The cultural machinery of the Third Reich was something that Emmy understood from the inside in ways that most observers did not, because she had spent her professional life inside the institution that the Nazis were now seeking to control and reshape. The Reich Chamber of Culture, established by Goebbels in September 1933 under the Reich Chamber of Culture law, organized all German cultural practitioners into compulsory professional organizations covering theatre, film, music, broadcasting, fine arts, press, and literature. Membership was mandatory for anyone who wished to practice a cultural profession in Germany, and membership was conditioned on racial and political criteria that excluded Jewish artists, critics, and cultural workers from professional life at a stroke. Emmy, as one of Germany's recognized theatrical performers, was a member of the Reich Chamber of Theatre, the Reichstheaterkammer, which fell under Goebbels' jurisdiction even as her husband's social world gave her a very different kind of institutional connection to the regime's power structure. The exclusion of Jewish artists from German cultural life was not an abstract policy to Emmy, but a concrete transformation of the professional world she had inhabited. Jewish theatre directors, writers, actors, and musicians, who had been colleagues and collaborators in the Weimar theatrical world, were stripped of their professional standing and eventually of much more than that. The Deutsches Theater in Berlin, where Emmy had performed, saw fundamental changes in its artistic direction as Jewish artists were expelled, and as the repertoire was reshaped to conform to Nazi cultural ideology. Emmy's response to these changes is not documented with any directness. What is documented is that she continued to perform and continued to enjoy the professional recognition that her position as Göring's wife amplified, rather than merely maintained, and that she did not, in any recorded instance, speak in defense of the Jewish colleagues whose careers were being destroyed around her. The regime's use of theatre as political instrument extended to the specifically political performances that Emmy participated in as the First Lady of the Third Reich, performances that were staged for an audience that was not a paying public in a conventional theatre, but the political class of a continent watching to assess whether Nazi Germany was a regime they could accommodate or one they needed to confront. Emmy's natural theatrical instincts served these performances well. She understood instinctively the difference between the performance that convinces and the performance that merely occupies space, and she brought to her role as Hermann Göring's wife the same professional seriousness she had brought to Goethe and Schiller. The result was a social performance so polished and so apparently sincere that even observers who were suspicious of the regime often found Emmy herself difficult to dislike, which was precisely the effect she was working to achieve, and which was, in its way, one of her most effective contributions to the Nazi project. The generation of Germans who came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, asking their parents and grandparents what they had done and known and chosen during the Nazi years, found in responses like Emmy's the characteristic shape of post-war evasion, the insistence on private virtue as a defense against public accountability, the deployment of domestic life as a screen against the political world that domestic life had in fact sustained and enabled. Emmy died in 1973 before the generation that would ask the hardest questions of its parents had fully come into its historical moment, before the scholarly reckoning that would produce the definitive accounts of Nazi participation and complicity had reached its mature form. In some ways, this spared her the most direct confrontations, but the historical record she left behind, including the stolen art, the diplomatic dinners, the Denazification testimony, and the self-serving memoir, is more than sufficient for the judgment that history has rendered and will continue to render. The curtain had come down for the last time. The audience, in this case, was history itself. Emmy Göring's story is one of the most precisely documented cases of what historians of the Nazi period have come to call the perpetrator-adjacent life. The life lived in full benefit of a criminal system by a person who did not personally pull any trigger or sign any death warrant, but whose presence and performance were integral to the system's functioning, and whose choices throughout were made in the direction of comfort over conscience, of loyalty over honesty, of private satisfaction over public responsibility. Well, that is it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video both informative and genuinely thought-provoking. Emmy Goring's story is one that history cannot and should not set aside. It is a story about complicity, about the moral weight of proximity to power, about the choices that people make when the world around them is doing something monstrous, and about what it means to live well from the proceeds of that monstrousness. It is also a story that continues to this day in the courtrooms where restitution claims are argued, in the museum provenance departments where researchers trace the wartime history of works in public collections, in the families of Holocaust survivors who are still seeking the return of what was taken from those who came before them. If you enjoyed learning about this topic, make sure to check out our videos about what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II and about the children of Nazi leaders, both of which explore how the families of the regime's most senior figures navigated the wreckage of the world that the regime left behind. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.